heart surgeon millionaire collapsed at his own gala. Only the maid's daughter knew how to save him. The grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Hotel glittered like a jeweled box on that cool October evening. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across the marble floors where Manhattan's elite mingled with champagne flutes in hand. Dr. Richard Ashford stood at the center of it all, silver-haired and impeccably dressed in a tailored tuxedo, accepting congratulations for his latest achievement, a groundbreaking surgical technique that had revolutionized cardiac procedures and earned him yet another accolade from the American Medical Association. At 58, Richard Ashford was the embodiment of success. His name graced the masthead of 3 prestigious hospitals. His face appeared regularly in medical journals and Forbes magazines. His penthouse apartment overlooked Central Park, and his collection of vintage cars filled a private garage. Everything about his life screamed accomplishment, yet beneath the polished exterior lurked a profound emptiness that even his ex-wife's generous alimony settlement couldn't fill. "Dr. Ashford, your speech was inspiring," a board member's wife gushed, touching his arm. Richard smiled graciously, the expression practiced and hollow. He'd delivered variations of the same speech 100 times over the past decade, about dedication, about the pursuit of excellence, about the sacred responsibility to save lives. He believed in those words once. Now they felt like lines from a script he could recite in his sleep. He excused himself and drifted toward the bar, where he ordered a Scotch neat. The alcohol burned pleasantly as it went down, and he ordered another. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from his 23-year-old girlfriend Vanessa, reminding him that they had reservations at Massa the following evening. He'd forgotten about it entirely. He'd been forgetting a lot lately. Details slipped through his mind like water through cupped hands. The third Scotch made the room spin slightly, though Richard was practiced enough to hide it. He was a man of discipline, after all. Discipline had built his career, had earned him his reputation, had allowed him to climb higher than most men dared dream. Discipline could certainly handle 3 glasses of Scotch. What Richard didn't know was that 3 glasses of Scotch, combined with the beta-blocker prescription he'd carelessly started taking 2 weeks ago for stress-related hypertension, created a dangerous cocktail. What he also didn't know was that he'd been ignoring chest pain for 3 months, writing it off as indigestion. What he absolutely didn't know was that his left anterior descending artery was 95% occluded, a ticking time bomb that had been placed directly in his chest by years of chronic stress, poor diet, and the kind of emotional neglect that manifests as physical disease. It started with a sensation in his left arm, a numbness that felt vaguely familiar yet terrifyingly strange. Then came the pressure in his chest, a tightening that made him pause mid-conversation with a pharmaceutical executive. Richard's hand instinctively moved to his sternum. He tried to take a deep breath, but the air seemed to catch in his lungs. The room tilted. Voices around him became distorted, as if he were underwater. He saw faces turning toward him, mouths opening, but the sounds were muffled, distant. There was a moment of crystalline clarity, where Richard understood, with absolute certainty, that something catastrophic was happening inside his body. Then the world went black. He collapsed like a felled tree, his body crashing onto the marble floor with a sickening crack. His skull struck the ground with enough force to draw blood. Chaos erupted instantly. Women screamed, men shouted, someone called for 911. Hotel staff rushed toward him, frozen between protocol and panic. A cardiologist from Johns Hopkins attempted CPR but found no pulse, no breath, no signs of life. Dr. Richard Ashford, the brilliant surgeon who had saved thousands of lives, was having a massive myocardial infarction, and for the first time in his existence, all his money, all his accomplishments, all his carefully constructed persona of invincibility meant absolutely nothing. In the servants' corridor on the second floor of the Metropolitan Hotel, Sophie Chin Williamson was restocking the supply closet when she heard the commotion from the ballroom below. She was 18 years old, tall and slender, with blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail and pale blue eyes that missed nothing. To the wealthy guests at events, maids were invisible, furniture to be navigated around, not truly seen. Sophie had learned to use this invisibility as her greatest advantage. She'd been working at the hotel for only 4 months, saving every penny toward her nursing school tuition. Her mother had cleaned houses for the wealthy for 30 years, and Sophie had vowed to herself that she would use that position as a launching point rather than a resting place. Nursing school was her ticket to a different kind of life, one where she had agency and purpose. The shouting grew louder. Sophie heard someone yell, "Is there a doctor? We need a doctor!" The irony would have made her laugh if the situation didn't sound so serious. This was Manhattan. Of course there would be doctors at a gala full of wealthy people, but doctors trained to practice medicine were different from doctors trained to save lives in emergencies. Against the rules, Sophie ventured downstairs. What she found in the ballroom made her heart stop. A man lay on the floor, blood trickling from a gash on his temple. He was completely still. A man in a doctor's uniform was performing chest compressions, counting aloud, 28, 29, 30. Breathe. Sophie pushed through the crowd. She'd volunteered at Mercy Hospital last summer as part of her pre-nursing certification program. She'd spent 50 hours observing the emergency department, watching how things actually worked when someone's life hung in the balance. She'd been there when a paramedic brought in a middle-aged man having a massive heart attack. She'd watched the controlled chaos, the precise movements, the way every second mattered. "Is an ambulance coming?" she called out, her voice cutting through the noise. A hotel manager glanced at her with irritation. "Yes, but how long?" "Probably 5 minutes, but—" 5 minutes was an eternity when someone wasn't breathing. Sophie had learned that in her volunteer work. The brain starts dying after 4 minutes without oxygen. Every second increased the risk of permanent damage. She moved forward without asking permission. "Excuse me, sir, I need you to move. You're doing the compressions wrong." The doctor, a cardiologist she would later learn, looked at her with outrage. "Young lady, I've been practicing medicine for 23 years. And I've been trained in BLS protocol," Sophie interrupted. "You're not achieving proper depth. Let me take over." "Absolutely not. Step back." But Sophie didn't step back. Instead, she moved directly beside the collapsed man and assessed the situation in the way she'd been trained. The man was unresponsive. No signs of breathing. A pulse check confirmed what she suspected: cardiac arrest. She didn't hesitate. She placed her hands on his sternum in the correct position, using her body weight to achieve the proper compression depth. "Come on," she murmured, pumping rhythmically. Come on, come on, come on. 30 compressions, 2 rescue breaths. Repeat. The other doctor had stopped, watching her with a mixture of skepticism and something like respect. The crowd pressed in, phones recording, but Sophie blocked it all out. She existed in a tunnel of focus with only one objective: keep this man alive until the ambulance arrived. The paramedics burst through the ballroom doors at minute 4. Sophie quickly briefed them. Unresponsive, no pulse, no respirations, witnessed collapse, beginning CPR immediately upon discovery. Male, 50s, no medical history that I'm aware of. The lead paramedic, a woman named Torres, nodded approvingly at Sophie's concise reporting. Okay, we've got him. Good work. But as they transferred the man to the stretcher, Sophie noticed something that made her stomach drop. She recognized his face. She'd seen it in the hotel's promotional materials, in medical journals her mother brought home. This was Dr. Richard Ashford, the founder of Ashford Medical Foundation and one of the most prestigious cardiac surgeons in the country. She'd just saved the life of a cardiac surgeon who had no idea she existed. Sophie told no one what had happened that night. She returned to her duties, cleaning up overturned champagne glasses and collecting abandoned shoes. Her mother would have been proud if she'd known, but Sophie had learned to keep her achievements quiet. Pride came before a fall, and Sophie had no intention of falling. 3 days later, she was summoned to the hotel manager's office. Her heart raced as she climbed the stairs. Had she done something wrong? Was she being fired? She'd broken protocol by leaving her post, even if it was to save someone's life. What she found was something entirely different. A man sat in the office chair, not the manager, but a distinguished-looking gentleman in his 60s wearing an expensive suit. Next to him was Torres, the paramedic from that night. Sophie Chen Williamson, the man said. My name is James Pembroke. I'm Dr. Ashford's attorney and personal advisor. I'm here to discuss what happened at the Gala 4 nights ago. Sophie's mouth went dry. I was just trying to help. You didn't just try to help, Torres interjected warmly. You performed a flawless BLS intervention. Your technique was textbook perfect. You potentially saved Dr. Ashford's life. The hospital's preliminary assessment suggests Dr. Ashford suffered a massive myocardial infarction, James explained. He was in full cardiac arrest for nearly 6 minutes. By all medical logic, he should have suffered severe brain damage or not survived at all. The fact that he's already regaining consciousness and showing no neurological deficits is being described as miraculous. Sophie felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. The man was alive. He was going to be okay. Dr. Ashford wants to meet with you, James continued. He's still recovering, but he's insistent. He's already spoken with our legal team about compensating you for your actions, and I don't want compensation, Sophie said quickly. I was just doing what anyone would do. Most people wouldn't do what you did, Torres said. You saw a crisis and didn't hesitate. That's not common. That's exceptional. The meeting was brief. James provided Sophie with a business card and a phone number. He mentioned something about legal liability and waivers, about Dr. Ashford's gratitude, about the possibility of a substantial reward. Sophie nodded politely, understanding only half of what was being said. All she could think was that she'd done the right thing, and now the man was going to be fine. She had no way of knowing that this intervention was about to change both their lives in ways neither could have predicted. Dr. Richard Ashford's recovery was swift, but psychologically devastating. The physical damage was manageable. The cardiologists at Mount Sinai Hospital performed an emergency angioplasty with stent placement. His massive artery was opened. Blood flow was restored to his heart muscle. The damage was significant, but not catastrophic, thanks entirely to the fact that his brain had received oxygen continuously throughout his arrest. But the psychological impact was something else entirely. Richard woke in the ICU to the acrid smell of hospital antiseptic and the rhythmic beeping of cardiac monitors. For the first time in his adult life, he was on the other side of the equation. He was the patient, not the doctor. He was the one hooked up to machines, dependent on others for basic functions. And it was terrifying. When he learned that he'd been saved by an 18-year-old maid with no medical degree, his initial reaction was anger mixed with humiliation. How could a teenager have intervened in his medical care? What if she'd done something wrong? But then Torres visited him with the medical records, the assessment data, the evidence that Sophie's intervention had been not just appropriate, but exceptional. "She saved your life," Torres told him bluntly. "Without her CPR, you would have had severe brain damage at minimum. You might have died in the ambulance. Instead, you're talking to me coherently. That's because of that young woman's quick thinking and training." Richard had spent 50 years building a career on the foundation of his own genius and effort. The thought that he owed his life to someone else, particularly someone from a walk of life he'd never truly considered, was almost unbearable. He'd built walls so high around himself that he'd forgotten what it meant to be vulnerable, to be needy, to be saved by someone who asked nothing in return. He requested to meet Sophie 3 days after his admission to the hospital. She arrived in her clean hotel uniform, uncomfortable and out of place among the heart monitors and IV stands. Richard looked diminished in the hospital bed, his commanding presence reduced to that of a sick man. "I owe you my life," he said without preamble. "I don't know how to repay that." Sophie fidgeted with her hands. "You don't owe me anything. I was trained to respond to emergencies. I just did my job." "You were trained to volunteer in an emergency capacity. You weren't supposed to be trained at all. You're 18 years old, working as a maid to pay for nursing school, and you had the presence of mind and skill to save my life." Richard paused, his expression softening. "Why nursing?" Sophie didn't expect the question. "Because it matters. Because people need help, and I want to be the kind of person who can help them. My mother cleaned houses for 40 years. She was invisible to most people, but I watched her care for people in her own way. I wanted to care for people in a way where I'm seen, where I have power to make a real difference." Richard listened. He heard the determination in her voice, the clarity of her purpose. He thought about his own journey to medicine, how it had started with idealism and ended in egotism. He thought about all the lives he'd saved and the life he'd neglected, his own. "I'd like to help you pay for nursing school," he said finally. Sophie's eyes widened. "I couldn't. It's not a gift. It's a debt. I owe you." He paused. "Besides, the world needs more people like you in nursing. It needs people who understand that saving lives isn't about ego or prestige. It's about service." The next year transformed both of them in unexpected ways. Sophie enrolled in NYU's nursing program with Dr. Ashford's financial support. But more importantly, Richard Ashford underwent his own transformation. Rehabilitation forced him to slow down. Mandatory restrictions on his activities meant he couldn't hide in his work. For the first time in decades, he had to sit with his own thoughts, his own mortality, his own failures. He began therapy, actual therapy, not just the surface-level wellness consulting he'd dabbled in before. He started reading books he'd always meant to read, but never had time for. He rebuilt his relationship with his ex-wife. He apologized to colleagues he'd treated poorly. He made donations to causes he actually cared about instead of causes that looked good on his resume. Most importantly, he became mentors to Sophie. She would visit him at his penthouse on Sunday afternoons, and they would discuss everything from nursing theory to life philosophy. Richard shared the mistakes he'd made, the opportunities he'd missed, the price he'd paid for his single-minded pursuit of success. Sophie shared her dreams and fears, her uncertainty about whether she was strong enough for the demands of health care. "You're already strong enough," Richard told her once. "You proved that on the night of the gala. But strength is also knowing when to ask for help, when to admit uncertainty, when to let others in." By Sophie's second year of nursing school, Richard had made a significant career change himself. He stepped back from his high-profile position at the leading cardiac surgery practice and took a role with a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing cardiac care to underserved populations. He worked fewer hours. He mentored more. He began to build a legacy based on service rather than prestige. But there was a complication neither of them had anticipated. Somewhere during all those Sunday afternoons, all those conversations about life and medicine and dreams, Richard had fallen in love with Sophie. It wasn't the kind of love he'd experienced before, the possessive, ego-driven attachment he'd felt toward Vanessa, or the comfortable companionship he'd known with his ex-wife. This was different. This was the love of seeing someone grow into their potential, of respecting their journey, of wanting their happiness above all else. He knew it was impossible. He was 39 years older than her. She was his protégé, his mentee, someone whose future he'd already altered by inserting himself into her life. Any romantic involvement would be a corruption of the purity of what they'd already built. So he said nothing. Sophie graduated from nursing school with honors. She accepted a position in the cardiac ICU at Mount Sinai Hospital, the same hospital where Richard had recovered. They still met for coffee occasionally, but the Sunday afternoon visits became less frequent as Sophie's demanding schedule took hold. A year after graduation, Sophie was on shift when a familiar face appeared in the cardiac ICU. A man in his 60s, sharp-dressed and distinguished, admitted with unstable angina. He was scheduled for a cardiac catheterization the following morning. It was James Pembroke, Richard's attorney and closest friend. Sophie cared for him with professional competence, but she noticed something in his chart that made her pause. Richard Ashford listed as his emergency contact. In the notation section, there was a personal message. "Have faith. You'll be fine. R.A." She found Richard in the hospital cafeteria the next morning. "I saw James in the ICU," she said, sitting down across from him with her coffee. "He has your message in his chart." Richard nodded, unsurprised. "He was my first real friend after my cardiac event. He's the one who insisted I actually deal with my life instead of just getting back to work. When he checked into the hospital yesterday, he was terrified. He needed to know I believed in him." Sophie studied Richard's face. He looked healthier than she'd ever seen him. Not the polished perfection of before, but genuinely well. His hair had grayed more. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of actual smiling rather than the practiced expression she'd known. He seemed lighter somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted. "He told me something yesterday that surprised me," Richard continued. "He said he was grateful for your arrival in my life. He said that whatever happened between us was the catalyst that finally made me human again. He said his best friend came back from the dead twice, once medically and once spiritually." Sophie didn't know what to say to that. "I've been thinking about that," Richard said carefully, "about gratitude and debt and the strange ways our lives intersect with others. I never believed in fate. I was trained to believe in science, in cause and effect. But sometimes I think about that gala, about how if you'd been in a different part of the hotel, if you'd decided to ignore the commotion, if you hadn't been exactly the right person at exactly the right moment," he trailed off. "You would have had brain damage or died," Sophie finished quietly. "Yes, and you would be finishing nursing school without ever having met me. Your life would be completely different." "Is that bad?" Sophie asked. "That my life changed?" Richard looked at her carefully. "No, your life is objectively better. You're doing meaningful work. You're making a real difference. You're becoming the kind of nurse who saves lives because it matters, not because it looks good. But, Sophie, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it as honestly as I mean it." Sophie's heart began to race. She had a feeling she knew what was coming, and she wasn't sure how she felt about it. "I love you," Richard said simply. "Not the way a mentor loves a student or an older man loves a younger woman out of some twisted fantasy. I love you the way you love this work, because I respect who you are, because I see your potential, because being near you makes me want to be better. But I'm also aware that this is complicated. I'm old enough to be your father. I helped finance your education. There's an inherent power imbalance that—" "Stop," Sophie said, holding up her hand. "That's not what this is." Richard waited. "When I was 12 years old, my mother was cleaning a house for a wealthy family in the Upper East Side," Sophie began. "The woman of the house found my mother crying in the kitchen. My mother's husband had just left. He'd run off with someone else and left her with nothing. The woman could have called her agency and had my mother replaced. Instead, she sat down and talked to her for 2 hours. She listened. She didn't offer money or fix the problem. She just witnessed my mother's pain and said it mattered." Sophie paused. "That woman taught me that invisible people still deserve to be seen. That kindness isn't transactional. That sometimes the most meaningful moments happen between people who come from completely different worlds. You didn't save my life that night at the gala, but you honored it. You saw me. You took my achievement seriously enough to change your entire life." "Sophie, let me finish. Yes, there's an age difference. Yes, you helped with my education. But that's not why I've spent the last 2 years falling in love with you. I've been falling in love with the man you became after that night. The man who actually lives instead of just achieving. I love you because you chose to be better. And I love you not as a protege loves her mentor, but as a woman loves a man she respects and admires and wants to build a life with." Richard felt something break open in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't the sharp pain of his heart attack. It was something else, something like hope. "I don't deserve you," he said quietly. Sophie reached across the table and took his hand. "Maybe not. But you're here anyway. We both are, and I think that matters." 2 years later, Sophie and Richard were married in the gardens of Central Park, surrounded by a small group of people who mattered to them both. His ex-wife gave a toast about second chances. Sophie's mother cried happy tears. Torres, the paramedic, attended as an honored guest and told the story of how the bride had saved the groom's life to anyone who would listen. Richard took early retirement from his nonprofit position, though he continued to mentor young doctors and nurses. Sophie became the head of a new cardiac nursing program designed to train nurses specifically for underserved populations. Together, they created the Ashford Chen Foundation, dedicated to providing access to excellent cardiac care regardless of ability to pay. In the years that followed, they had 2 children, a daughter they named Grace and a son they named Marcus. Richard, who had spent so much of his life believing that love was weakness, discovered that it was actually the source of true strength. Sophie, who had been raised in invisibility, found that her light shone brightest when reflected in someone else's eyes. On their 10th anniversary, they returned to the Metropolitan Hotel for dinner at the restaurant where the gala had taken place. They stood in the ballroom where Richard had collapsed, where Sophie had stepped out of her invisible role to save a stranger's life. "Do you ever regret it?" Richard asked, holding her hand. "Coming to find me when you heard the commotion? Any part of you wish that night had gone differently?" Sophie considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally, "because something had to break before you could be rebuilt. Something had to shatter before you could see the cracks that needed healing. I'm grateful I could be part of that moment. But Richard, I want you to understand something important." "What's that?" "I didn't save your life because you were important. I didn't save your life because you were a famous surgeon or a wealthy man. I saved your life because every life matters. Every person deserves to be saved. You're the one who taught me that, not in words, but in how you've lived since that night. You've spent the last decade treating every patient like they were me, like they were worth the best you have to offer." Richard pulled her close. In that moment, surrounded by memories of the night that changed everything, he understood something that had taken him 58 years to learn. The measure of a life isn't in achievements or accolades. It's in the hearts we touch and the lives we elevate. The invisible Maid's daughter had become a pillar of his existence, and he, the celebrated surgeon, had become witness to her transformation. Together, they'd created something neither could have built alone. It took a cardiac event for a man to die so that a better man could live. It took an act of compassion for a woman to discover her power. It took the collision of 2 worlds for either of them to truly understand what it meant to be alive.